And for comments on the spaceport and many other issues related to New Mexico's legislative session coming up, I'm pleased to have with us for the rest of the half hour Paul Gessing. He is president of the Rio Grande Foundation and a regular guest on our program. Paul, it's good to have you here.
Good to be here, Fred.
So let me get your reaction first to this story on the spaceport. As you heard, very different opinions on this enormous project.
Yeah, it's something that's still polarizing. Some people certainly hope and think that it was a wise investment. I don't find myself in that particular camp. I'm much more on the skeptical side, as we have been from day one. But it is something that if you think that space tourism is going to take off and that this is going to be a boon for New Mexico, I can see why you still hold out hope for that. I just don't think it's the proper role for government at all to be engaging in this kind of speculative activity.
You know, Paul, I thought one pivotal comment in the report came from the new director of the spaceport. He says for the spaceport to be self-sustaining, quote, makes no sense. In other words, even if this facility were to somehow attract a lot of customers, it would still need government investment to survive, and he compared it to airports. What do you make of that statement?
Now, I'm no expert on airport finance. However, airports do have a number of revenue sources. There are fees that passengers pay that fund a lot of the airport facilities. I don't know if it's all of it or not, and I would be happy to propose and see if we could achieve airport privatization, because I think they should stand alone, but that's obviously a different issue. The issue is that people do in every community benefit from those airports on a day-to-day basis, and they generate economic activity, and they're really important for communities to have in them as a point of access and commerce. So the idea that they should or should not stand alone, we can discuss that and disagree on that, but I really do think it's something that the activity at the airports does indicate that they are a relevant part of every economy that they're in.
Not to mention that airports are not speculative. In other words,
Exactly.
We know that you can get in a plane and fly somewhere and that it's a viable business for areas all over the country.
This is the spaceport, as I've said before, is like building an airport before the Wright brothers took their first flight. Extremely speculative.
Yeah, and well, especially in the sense of our spaceport, because we're talking about the biggest tenet being space tourism, and this is something that often gets, missed in the discussion about the spaceport, is that this is a new idea to send non-astronauts up into space, and so it is right now a speculative idea.
Well, not only new, but we don't know what technology will ultimately take hold.
Right.
Most of the manned space flights, if not all of them in American history, have been vertical takeoffs from a launch pad. That's not the model that that you're using at the Spaceport America. There are other spaceports around the country that have used that vertical takeoff type equipment there at those spaceports. So it is a very big bet on a very specific technology, and it's something that there's a lot of reasons why we had concerns about it. And some of the public and guests on the show had those concerns as well.
Yes, you're referring to, we did an hour-long show with the spaceport director, someone from your organization and others, to talk about this more in depth. Though I want to ask you about process here too, because this really applies to things that might happen that go far beyond the spaceport. Taxpayers who approved a gross receipts tax for the spaceport were sold on the idea that it would be used to pay for the facility. But now, after the bonds are paid each year, there's a lot of funding left over, and that is going to operations. What do you make of that?
Well, it's along the lines of anything that government says is going to happen. As far as I believe, it's being very skeptical of that and saying caveat emptor, buyer beware, because government officials often only tout benefits. They don't tout any drawbacks from a given government scheme. They also leave out key details when they're selling things, like that this is going to be an ongoing tax that's going to be imposed, and that money is just dedicated for the spaceport no matter what it is dedicated to, you're never going to see that tax rate go down. And we tried to educate and tried to bring some of these concerns to bear during those campaigns, because there was local elections at the county level throughout this area. And it hurts when you have government officials with that government platform and the financial backing of the state and whatnot versus small nonprofit organizations and others who don't have the funding access that they have and the access to the levers of power. It's a very unfair fight.
As you know, beyond how the money is used, another issue is that while folks were told by supporters this tax was to build the spaceport, it turns out it's a permanent tax that was enacted. So unless the tax is repealed, even after the bonds are paid off, Doña Ana and Sierra County taxpayers will be giving money to the spaceport every time they buy something that has GRT applied to it. In your view, does New Mexico need better disclosure for voter initiatives?
Absolutely. It should be more clear exactly what voters are being asked to vote on in any given election, because I don't think that that is always fairly written and fairly revealed information in some of these elections. But on the other hand, voters need to be more skeptical. And unfortunately, this is one of the challenges that we at the Rio Grande Foundation, quite frankly, face, is that voters in this state are very trusting and willing to support government ideas across the board, and they instead need to be much more concerned about what is really going to happen with this and what other uses of those limited tax dollars could be achieved as opposed to building this very speculative facility or any infrastructure projects or any government programs across the state. I just don't think people approach government in this state in particular skeptically enough.
Paul, I know the Rio Grande Foundation has been concerned about another project that was started under the Richardson administration, the Rail Runner, and I understand it's even in worse financial shape now due to some upgrades that are required. Bring us up to date on this.
Yeah, well, the Rail Runner for several years now and for several years more is costing overall about $50 million. About half of that is for the infrastructure, and that's not going away no matter what. You could stop the train right now and you're still going to be paying on or about $25 million. Then
so that goes beyond what people are paying when they ride the Rail Runner. You're saying $50 million the state is having to pay?
Oh yeah, yeah. The people paying the fares, the Rail Runner is about it's less than 10% fare box recovery. That means how much of the operating cost, and that's the second component. So it's about 25 for the infrastructure, and that's a totally sunk cost that's not coming back, and nothing that you pay is going to the infrastructure in terms of when you go onto the train. Now, operating costs, it's another 25 million or so coming from taxpayers, different pots of money. Some of that does come from the fare box. That's not, it's still 25 even with the inclusion of that fare box money. But the new feature of the Rail Runner is that a new federal regulation called positive train control. It's supposed to prevent train crashes, and whether it's a good regulation or not, it's coming down the pipes from Washington. That's a $50 million one-time payment that we are somehow going to have to come up with, again, out of tax dollars. So the money does not stop flowing to these government projects once you sign on with as a voter. You keep on paying and paying and paying. I know Dan Hicks wants more money at the spaceport. Not quite $50 million, but the Rail Runner is going to be a very, very costly project if we keep it moving forward.
And another project was added after the Rail Runner in Albuquerque, a massive public transportation project. Just this week, we learned that there's no idea when it will even get underway, even though it was already supposed to be running, because there are massive design problems apparently with this.
Apparently so, and we're not shocked by any of this. This is ART. We still don't have the federal check. I think that's the first thing that people in Albuquerque are really having some heartburn about. We've had a mayoral transition from the Berry administration, which really pushed this thing to Keller, and Tim Keller has expressed his concern and obviously released all this information, but we still don't have the federal dollars, the federal $75 million or so in federal money that's supposed to come in. It was never a good idea. It's always expensive, more expensive than you expect. And once you lay the track, build the spaceport, put the bus lanes in, it's very difficult to step back, and you've already spent that money. It's the sunk costs, and you can't get them back. And it's one of the reasons why we are always very skeptical of anything but the most proven projects that government embarks on, because you always wind up with these kinds of problems. And the ART is really going to be a difficult situation for the city of Albuquerque, the budget, and the new administration.
And of course, this comes at a time when there are projections of big budget deficits in New Mexico's largest city, and so this potentially affects everyone in the state of New Mexico. I mean, the success of our biggest city is important to everyone.
Absolutely. Well, we're already seeing discussion in Santa Fe among leadership in the legislature over essentially a COPS program, hiring police officers, traditionally a local prerogative there, that you can bet if the city had more money laying around that they would have already hired those police officers and wouldn't be relying on the state for that kind of program. So it does affect everybody in New Mexico how the city of Albuquerque performs, both economically and with regard to its budget and the spending situation, how much money they may be able to get out of Santa Fe that's ultimately borne by state taxpayers as a whole.
Yeah. Now, I know you get these questions all the time. What do you say to those who argue, well, we pay for roads and bridges. Why not pay for buses and trains, other public transportation?
So I like to take a step back and say, what would a free market transportation network look like? I would love to see government take one, maybe even two big steps back from funding transportation. By two steps, I mean one step would be to get the federal government out of this equation and allow the state and local governments to really fund and manage their transportation networks. A second big step would be to allow some kind of private entities to be involved in that at the operational and construction level that they're not now. And if you go to Europe and you drive in France and Italy and some of these nations, you'll see privatized toll roads over there. And so that could happen here in the United States. It would involve totally reworking the way the gas taxes work. And it's very complicated, but the fact is that by and large, the roads are paid for. They're able to be used by everyone. They're benefiting everyone, and the gas taxes do pay for those. It's not an ideal system, but it clearly is a need that we all benefit from. Some of these other projects, certainly the Rail Runner, when you're only achieving a 10% fare box recovery, New York City subway is north of 50%, the DC Metro is like 40%. That's at least a reasonable rate of return, and it's an indicator that these projects are at least benefiting large numbers of people. But 10% is extremely low even by transit standards.
Well, and implicit in your answer is that before building something like this, which is massive, and as you pointed out earlier, normally once it's done, permanent, there has to be, I would assume most would agree, a real analysis of how much use will go to this. You can't just say, well, build it and they'll come, right?
Exactly. And for the Rail Runner, you can just take the train. I would encourage people to do it from Albuquerque, from Belen up to Santa Fe, and you have too many wide open spaces, too few people living in those areas to achieve any kind of success with transit. The ART is actually replacing a very successful, well, relatively successful bus system that ran along Route 66 and did very well. And it was a form of what the ART is, which is bus rapid transit. It's supposed to be faster than driving in your vehicle. And something called Rapid Ride was the previous model. It's actually more flexible and better than I think ART is going to prove to be, even when they get that thing up and running. So it just, again, goes back to when it comes to being a citizen, trying to push back against the bill of goods that frequently politicians are pushing on us with regard to these massive infrastructure projects.
Moving to other issues that are facing the New Mexico legislature, it does not look like comprehensive reform of the gross receipts tax has much of a chance due to a short 30-day session. But I want to give you a chance to talk about what the Rio Grande Foundation would like to see from the GRT.
Well, first and foremost, I'll challenge your premise just a little bit, and I'll say that if the legislature wanted to do something, wanted to reform the tax code, 30 days is enough time to focus on it. This is a budget-only session. There's absolutely nothing wrong with doing budget plus tax reform in 30 days, and I think there's more than enough time. So I'll say that at the outset, and that's something that you could have legislators and we could all have a nice debate on. But the fact is you're right, it's not looking likely and it's not going to happen. And it's something that needs to happen. We need to do something in the state of New Mexico to achieve higher economic growth, to remove some of the barriers to economic activity. We're the second highest unemployment rate state in the country. We're really having some challenges seeing young people move out of our state. And it's something that needs to happen. Now, we've touted ideas like right to work and deregulation and reform on that side. The Democrats who control the legislature don't seem particularly interested in right to work and other of those kinds of issues. So we really hoped that with the study coming out, bipartisan support for a study by Ernst & Young, $400,000 for that in tough budgetary times, that we were going to see some action on revenue neutral tax reform, dropping the rates, removing the pyramiding, trying to make the gross receipts tax more competitive with our neighboring states. And unfortunately, another year is going to come and go, and we're going to be in the same boat as we have been. So I don't really see much improvement, at least generated in New Mexico. Oil and gas, we're going to ride that wave, and if oil and gas prices remain high and production remains relatively strong, we'll be okay. But unfortunately, that is a very volatile industry and something that I don't think we can base New Mexico's economy on forever.
Okay, Governor Martinez has proposed another $25 million in her proposed budget for child care assistance programs. What do you make of this idea?
Yeah, this is kind of pre-K oriented, and of course this gets into the debate we've had in recent years over tapping the permanent fund for the pre-K, and there's kind of a transition into that child care services. The governor has definitely jumped on board with the concept that we want to spend more money. It's just how much money and from what pot of revenue do we want to do this.
Well, and you've raised questions on your blog, Errors of Enchantment, about the success of some of these early intervention programs as well. Specifically
the pre-K, and there's evidence across the states, because other states have done this, that pre-K is definitely something that it's not by any stretch a silver bullet. There's obviously problems with it. It's very expensive. Some states have seen decent results. Some states have seen very poor results. It's an open question, and I don't think that it's something we need to ramp up on a statewide level. We need more study and more analysis of what we're already doing before we jump down that rabbit hole of tapping the permanent fund. Now, these early childhood services are a much more broad, much more ill-defined aspect of the plan, and I want to see, again, real-world results. So $25 million is not a ton of cash. It's not a huge amount of money. It's not something that we necessarily would jump on board with, but it's the governor wants to do it, and we'll see how it goes, and then hopefully we have some real good analysis of it and an honest analysis to see if it's something that should be expanded or just eliminated.
In our final minutes here, I want you to address something you mentioned, the permanent fund. We hear about using the permanent fund for pre-K, for other things, even from some candidates who want to be New Mexico's next governor. What do you make of this idea?
It is the obvious place to go for candidates or for politicians who think we don't have enough money and want to spend more. So that permanent fund to them is just sitting there waiting to be tapped by them. It tends to be for a lot of big government programs, and we don't support a lot of those, and I think the data doesn't support a lot of those, most notably the pre-K, the massive investment that they're looking for. Are there potential areas that we could use that money for? We could have discussions about, say, eliminating the personal income tax and using the permanent fund to do that. It's something that should be considered, but the whole push is more government, more spending, and that's not where we need to be. Right now, that money is indeed being used to help support this state when times are tough, as we've just seen.
And again, implicit in your answer, I suppose, again, an analysis to see if you do this,
right,
how will it affect the permanent fund over time?
Exactly.
So we got to have answers.
Exactly. And what you're doing with that money, it too often, I think, is seen by people as just free money because they don't understand what this money is, what it's supposed to be used for, and where it comes from. It's ill-defined for a lot of people. It needs to be very specific in terms of the approach that we take to using these resources.
Paul Gessing is the president of the Rio Grande Foundation. Paul, thank you, as always, for being here.